Peter Stursberg was born in China in 1913. His mother was half Japanese and half Irish, and his father was a member of the colonial administration, the British colonial administration in China. So he grew up in a curious kind of imperial household of mixed race, and ultimately ended up in Canada when he was very early 20s and started his career as a journalist. He had become one of the very first people working for the CBC News. This is around 1938, and the CBC had just set up a news department. And of course, like he would have been at the time in 1938, 25 years old, say. So like everybody, every journalist of the period, when the war broke out, the number one thing they wanted to do was they wanted to go to cover the war. So finally in 1942, they agreed to send him, and in early 1943, he arrived in London. He covered them, first of all, in the invasion of Sicily, and then as they progressed up Italy and across the so-called Hitler line, so he followed the Canadian troops all through Italy. Then he followed the Canadian troops for the liberation of Holland, and then he ended up in Berlin just shortly after VE Day. And through the course of it all, of course, what he was doing was he was reporting on how the war was going from the point of view of Canada. And so it was the first time that people could actually hear what war sounded like. There's a famous piece of my father broadcasting from the Leary line in Italy, where you can hear him say, "Listen to the guns roar."
Just listen to those guns roar.
And then you hear the guns in the background. So it was actually allowed, and the Canadians were the only ones who had this technology, it actually allowed the Canadians to bring people into the sound of the war in a way that had never happened before.
We're in the attic of an old Italian farmhouse that overlooks the front as it's on a slight ridge. I'm standing here looking out of a hole in the wall that was made by a shell during the fighting here 2 days ago. This house, though, hasn't really been very badly damaged. It's the only one standing that I've seen for miles around.
Peter Stursberg landing in Sicily was the first time a Canadian broadcaster had covered Canadian troops on the move. He arrived just in time to cover the liberation of one of the key objectives of the Canadian force that landed in Sicily, the town of Agira, which was liberated in late July 1943. And so he came basically the evening of the battle and was able to get there when the town square had been liberated, and the Seaforth Highlanders of Canada pipe band was playing, the church bells in the background. It was able to broadcast for the first time Canadians liberating a European city. After years of really bad news in the wartime news coming from the CBC and elsewhere, this was quite an event. During the Second World War, radio was the only electronic media. There was print reporting, there was certainly newsreel and film that had been around for some time, and photographic reporting was certainly available. But radio was at the cutting edge of technology. It was a way to bring, with only a few hours delay in some cases, or at the least a day or more, a delay, reporting of real live sounds from the battlefield into people's living rooms in a way that had never been the case before. This was done through very bulky, by today's standards, portable recording units that weighed dozens of pounds each, that were carted on a jeep that could then be brought to a mobile recording van and all of this sort of thing. But the result was that broadcasters like Storsberg were able to lay live commentary over events as they happened.
It's a great honor for the School of Journalism and Communication to host the annual Peter Stursberg Foreign Correspondents Lecture. We're in the business here of training young journalists, and down the road, some of them will likely end up reporting from conflict zones. The Stursberg Lecture Series is one way of ensuring that when they do, the journalism they produce will be smart and meaningful. Hearing from the best of today's foreign correspondents can't help but inspire journalists of the future to do their best, and hopefully their journalism will also contribute to more informed decision-making around the world.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the fourth annual Peter Stursberg Foreign Correspondents Lecture, hosted by the School of Journalism and Communication at Carleton University. My name is Alan Thompson. I'm the head of the journalism program here at Carleton, a program that is proudly celebrating its 75th anniversary. I'm hosting this from my office here at Carleton and want to thank you very much for joining us. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the Carleton University campus is located on the unceded and traditional territory of the Algonquin Nation. Now, this is an annual event named for one of Canada's legendary war correspondents, Peter Stursberg. He was among the first to cover Canada's troops during the Second World War. He was the last living correspondent of that era when he passed away at the age of 101 in 2014. His children, Judith Lowry and Richard Stursberg, decided to honor his memory with a special initiative here at the School of Journalism at Carleton. And I would like to acknowledge my predecessor in this role, Susan Harada, for the work that she did to help to launch that initiative. Now, the Storsberg initiative has two components. The first is the Peter Stursberg Award in Conflict Journalism and Media Studies. It's given out annually to a student in Carleton's Master of Journalism program who's pursuing a project that touches on conflict reporting. The first award was given to Ash Abraham, who did a report looking at the plight of North Korean migrants living in South Africa. Last year's award was given to Niranjali Verma, who traveled to India to report on the situation of parents who have lost their children who were recruited by ISIS. Unfortunately, because of the travel restrictions imposed by COVID, we've not been able to give out the award this year, but we hope to return to normal next year. Now, the second component of the Storsberg initiative is this annual lecture, the Peter Stursberg Foreign Correspondents Lecture. Over the years, it's been delivered by the likes of Lise Doucette of the BBC, Janine De Giovanni, and Adrian Arsenault last year of the CBC. Tonight, we're taking a slightly different tack in more ways than one. Now, to be honest, we had thought of postponing this year's event in hopes that we could come back in person next year. I'd begun doing some research about who we might invite, and when I met Larry Madowo, it took me a moment to realize we couldn't wait for months to hear what he had to say, to hear the urgency of his reporting. Larry, a proud native of Kenya, is the BBC Washington correspondent, and he's been covering the US presidential election and its somewhat bizarre aftermath. Now, Larry challenges our traditional stereotype of the foreign correspondent. And I think tonight's talk probably challenges some of the traditional notions of what conflict reporting means. There may even be some out there who think it's controversial to suggest that the United States is somehow engaged in a conflict. Now, we are celebrating Peter Stursberg's work as a war correspondent, but it's worth noting that much of his career was spent observing and analyzing conflict of another type, politics. He wrote extensively about Canadian politics. I think he would very much enjoy this evening's event, focusing on a conflict that's grown out of a political struggle, a war of words, and disinformation. His son, Richard Stursberg, and I were chatting about this just the other night, about the shifting nature of conflict. I'd like to invite Richard to join us now on behalf of the Stursberg family and to say a few words. Richard.
Well, thanks very much, Alan. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm very pleased that this is the fourth in the series of lectures. As you pointed out, this is the Peter Stursberg lecture on conflict journalism. And my father, of course, covered conventional wars. We still have conventional wars. Unfortunately, we still have traditional armies in uniforms fighting between states. But increasingly, what conflict looks like changes and has changed significantly over time. When we think now about conflict, we think about everything from asymmetrical conflicts, wars between conventional armies and insurgents. We think about violence directed against civilians in the form of terrorism. We think about cyber warfare. And more recently still, we have come to see the use of threatened violence to deter people from exercising their rights or to intimidate officials from doing their duty. We see it in marches by heavily armed men. We see it in trolls releasing people's addresses and telephone numbers. We see it in the vast quantities of hate speech flowing through Facebook and Twitter. I think it's a very good thing that that Carleton has broadened the issue of conflict journalism, as Alan was saying, beyond studying conventional warfare to all these other forms of conflict. How journalists cover any and all of this seems to me to be an excellent and appropriate extension of the Peter Stursberg lecture on conflict journalism. I think my father would have been very pleased by the broadening of this direction. So my thanks to the Carleton School. I look forward to the talk. I look forward to hear what Larry has to say and to Nahlah's conversation with him. Thank you very much, Alan.
Great, thank you, Richard, and through you, thanks to your family for your generous support of the Storsberg Award and this annual lecture. At its core, this event is about journalism, good journalism, the kind of reporting that helps us to understand our world, particularly during times of human conflict. How fitting that the moderator of tonight's event is one of Canada's best known foreign correspondents, the CBC's Nahlah Ayed, host and producer of IDEAS. I'm proud that Nahlah is a graduate of Carleton's Master of Journalism program. She began her career as a journalist at Canadian Press on Parliament Hill, where we met all those years ago. In 2002, she joined the CBC and for a decade reported from across the Middle East, then covered the world from London for another decade, covering some of the biggest stories of our times. In 2012, she published her award-winning memoir, 1,000 Farewells. Nahlah, as our moderator, will formally introduce our guest speaker, Larry Madowo. We'll engage him in a conversation after his remarks, and then take your questions. And I just want to remind you, there is a question and answer tab at the bottom of your screen, and you can post your questions there. I should also note more than 600 people registered for this event tonight, which is a record for this event. And most of those people have joined us on Zoom, and some have moved into an overflow capacity on YouTube. So we're off to a great start. And now I will turn this evening over to Nahlah.
Thank you very much, Alan, for the lovely introduction and for inviting me to be here. I'm honored to have been invited to moderate this very important event. Good evening, everybody, and thank you very much for being here tonight. For followers of international news, Larry Madowo requires no introduction. You know Larry as North America's correspondent for the BBC, based in Washington, who has also anchored breaking news from the BBC's DC studios and presented its flagship program, BBC World News America. You may be familiar with his unforgettable reporting and his singular sense of humor, but even so, you may not be familiar with his entire story. Larry started his career in his native Kenya as a business reporter and anchor on 2 national TV networks. He was also an anchor for CNBC Africa, based in Johannesburg. More recently, he was the BBC's Africa business editor. He was named among the 100 most influential Africans in 2018, and he was also named a young global leader by the World Economic Forum in 2020. He has reported from nearly 40 countries, lived on 3 continents, and interviewed some of the world's most prominent people. And tonight I am honored to welcome him to Canada, even if it's only virtually. Larry Madowo, you are live.
Thanks a lot. Next time it will be in real life, but we have to make do with this. So thank you to Alan Thompson, to Nahlah for that introduction. It makes me sound a lot more accomplished than I really am, and which I like. I didn't need that background. You know, in this Zoom era, you kind of have to find a way of standing out, and in the absence of anything else, you look sophisticated by looking like you live in a library. So that's what I was going for. My thanks also to Carleton University and the School of Journalism and Communication for inviting me. It's a great honor to deliver the 4th annual Peter Stursberg lecture. And there are, let me see, there are 169 participants here. That is 169 more than I expected would be here. So thank you. I'm not an accomplished war correspondent like Peter Storsberg, whose work I greatly admire. So I'm grateful to the Storsberg family and to Carleton for lowering their standards this year. And thank you to Richard for that setting up at the beginning. My only claim to fame is that I'm Lise Doucette's colleague, and who's a national treasure in Canada, I gather, as she should be. She's the BBC's chief international correspondent and a dear, dear friend of mine. Actually, that's not true. I've actually never even met her. But she did come on my show when I was anchoring BBC World News America, and she stayed up at 1 a.m. in Riyadh to do the live hit for us. So it's sort of like we're friends, separated by 2 continents and an ocean and a satellite link, but you know, good enough. I agreed to deliver this lecture because I could do it straight from my house here in DC. I don't know what you've heard about DC reporters, but we don't like to leave the Beltway bubble to go out into the real world and meet people. So a former reality TV star turned politician likes to refer to it by its lesser known name, the Swamp. So greetings from the Swamp in DC. DC is actually a pretty long way from Siaya. That's in Western Kenya, where I was born and raised. My dad was an accountant. My mom was a primary school teacher. My dad was an accountant for the local town council. And my mom introduced me to the wonder of books, and she taught me to be curious. And she gave me an appreciation for the world outside of our little environment. So I knew pretty fast that I wanted to travel and go to all these mysterious places I had read about. But growing up in Western Kenya, where we didn't have a television, so it's strange that I work on TV now, I grew up on the BBC and heard of all these reports from all these places. The only people in my environment I knew who got to travel were missionaries. So I figured I'm going to go be a priest. So I went to a Catholic seminary. And we used to be told that many are called, but few are chosen. So I'm guessing I'm not one of those who was chosen. And so I tried out I thought I might go to law school, but it just seemed like a lot of work and I was not that committed to it. And so I figured journalism seems to have a pretty low barrier for entry. And where can I get paid to talk and to travel full time? And here I am. That's what I do now. So I haven't figured out anything else. So I'm going to keep doing this. I got baptized by fire because my first election to cover was in 2007 in my native Kenya. And what happened is both leading candidates, Mwai Kibaki and Raila Odinga, declared that they won. And the president, Mwai Kibaki, was quickly sworn in again in an evening event that was broadcast on national television. 1,300 people died because their supporters went to war. Thousands of people were displaced, and it ended up at the International Criminal Court. They were tried. Some of the main actors were tried for crimes against humanity. The cases eventually collapsed, but it was a pretty jarring start to my journalism career. I've then spent some time covering elections in other parts of the continent, like South Africa and Malawi and Nigeria, and Uganda, where they're going back to the polls in January, and it's already been quite dramatic out there. And US ambassadors often are at the forefront of telling African countries and African politicians and African governments, you have to respect free and fair elections and protect the will of the people and make sure there's a peaceful transfer of power. And so when I took this job, I figured I understood America. I had consumed American pop culture and music and entertainment and sports. I went to grad school here and I had a great time at Columbia University in New York. I spent most of the pandemic living in Texas, which is the heart of Trump country. And so I just felt like I thought I knew the country, but what I've since learned that America is such a country of contradictions, and what looks easy to understand at the surface is often not what you see when you scratch even a little beyond the surface. And in Africa, I've seen powerful people, for instance, try to block those who are likely to vote against them from getting the right to vote. Because if people who don't support you don't vote, then have a higher chance of winning, right? In America, there's a nicer kinder way to describe it: voter suppression. You know, the same way corruption here is called lobbying in DC, so it doesn't look so bad. And if you register as a lobbyist, then hey, you can totally do that. And so I did a little documentary recently in the state of Georgia, where Black people and other minorities are disproportionately affected by very strict voter ID laws, exact signature matches that are required. They have fewer options to vote. They close a lot of polling centers, and lots of other ways that are seen to disenfranchise them. And one quote that stuck with me was from Andrea Young. She's the executive director of the American Civil Liberties Union of Georgia. And she said, "This democracy is fragile." And it's not the word I was expecting in reference to a democracy that's been around since 1776. So it stayed with me. And it was especially striking to hear because I was in Georgia and there'd been just another round of protests after the killing of George Floyd, people agitating for racial justice in the country. And President Trump called Black Lives Matter a symbol of hate. And so I was interviewing this man in rural Georgia, and he said he'd been organizing protests for Black Lives Matter in the community. He's a white man who's got a completely white family, but he just felt this was an important issue that he needed to get involved in. And his neighbors didn't like him so much so that he was considering moving to a place that was much more welcoming. And he mentioned casually that, oh yeah, there's a KKK hub, a meeting place about 2 blocks, two streets down the road. I'm like, okay, this was not the first time that I felt grateful that I was working with a white cameraman, with a white producer. Because as a Black male in this country, there are moments where I'm traveling in predominantly white neighborhoods where I feel that I might be seen as out of place, where somebody might consider me an intruder and either call the police on me or decide to engage me themselves. And we all know how those situations end, right? And it's only in those moments when I'm glad that I have some sort of protection, that because I have these other colleagues who don't look like me, that I might look like I belong. And this is a narrative that's been happening across this country, especially this past year. I remember speaking to the family of Brianna Taylor in Kentucky. And Brianna Taylor was 26 when she was killed, only 2 years younger than my own sister. And I can't imagine the pain, the heartbreak for the family. She had dreams of becoming a nurse. She was asleep in her own bed. And the way that she's become a polarizing figure, she's become a woman who's one of the few Black women who's become a rallying call in the Black Lives Matter protests across the nation, across the world. But for her family, she's somebody they knew. She's somebody that they talk to all the time. She posted a Snapchat video that she was watching a movie with her boyfriend just before she went to sleep. And her aunt was telling me, oh yeah, I remember telling her that's pretty cool. And then when she got the call, she couldn't believe it. But that's the sort of environment that I was reporting in now. This war of words that you see in the exchange of ideas, and what both sides of the political divide here think the other side is going to destroy their way of life. They're going to destroy America. When you speak to hardcore Republicans, they think that the Democrats are going to introduce socialism, which is shorthand for communism, and America will cease to exist the way they see it. And the Republicans also see themselves as the only people in the line that's protecting what they see as progressive values and a place that's welcoming, a country of immigrants and all that. And I'm in the middle of it as an outsider looking through it and thinking this is so fascinating, but also so instructive for our audiences around the world who don't follow the palace intrigues and inside baseball kind of coverage that the American media provides. They don't know who's in and out of favor in the White House, but they wonder what's happening out there. Why is it that the president is claiming that he won the election, which is this alternate reality that he inhabits, where he still got a chance of claiming victory and where he did not lose the election by 4.5 points and nearly 7 million votes. And it's this environment where cities were getting boarded up, businesses are getting boarded up in the run up to the election because they fear there might be an outbreak of violence. And these were mostly, I remember being in Philadelphia, being here in Washington, D.C., in Atlanta, where businesses were trying to board up ahead of that. And most of them are Democratic-run cities. And I remember speaking to one commentator, a conservative commentator, Gary Abernethy, who writes for the Washington Post. And he was like, you see, that's the fear of violence is not from the right, it's from the left. They're afraid that all the violence and the looting and the rioting we've seen in this summer came from the left, not from the right. And you wonder how two sides and two people can see a very different set of facts and disagree on what is fact and what's not. And my job this past few months has been to try and translate America for the rest of the world And I don't always think that I've done a good job of it, because I've also seen a lot of Africans looking at this election and scratching their heads and wondering what's going on there, because they saw a statement from Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, who called on elections in Africa generally. The first statement did not even name a specific country, and called for free and fair elections and the rule of law and, you know, peaceful transfer of power and all those good things. And Africans were like, isn't it a little ironic, because you have a lot of issues back home, and how do you not have the self-awareness to realize that you don't have moral authority to be lecturing us right now on this very issue that you're facing back home, where it's not clear if the president is going to concede, where it's not clear if he's going to leave office. But also, for a lot of people in the world, it's two older men trying to lead a younger multicultural nation into the future. And I've seen people like that. And one final point I wanted to make also, which I'm not sure people outside of the US understand, how the level of support the core base of President Trump has is almost similar to that of a cult leader. I've seen actual cult leaders, I've interviewed actual cult leaders, and when I compare the kind of devotion their followers have for them, it's very similar to the core base of President Trump. And I've been speaking to them in Atlanta, in the Carolinas, in Kentucky, in Louisiana, in Texas. And they see this man as the one man who believes what they believe, who represents the conservative values, who appoints the judges they agree with, and who is protecting their way of life. And there's a smaller but just equally passionate base that supports Joe Biden, even if they don't always agree with his policies, but they say without him, no other Democrat has a fair shot at the presidency, and therefore, who can protect the America that they live in, the America that they're free to love whoever they love, that they're free to support whoever they support, and they can get on with their life. And hopefully, if he throws in forgival of all your college debt, if he throws in universal healthcare for everyone, that's a plus. But at the very basic level, it's just this is the one man who will make sure that I don't have to worry about politics, because it's been a bizarre circus for so long. They just want a return to normalcy. So I don't want to rant any more than I already have, because you're probably just wondering what is happening. And I'm going to go back to Nahlah for her questions.
Larry, thank you very much for your insights. And most of all, thank you for all your reportage and your hard work. It was a very tough job that you had over the last few months, and we all appreciate it. A reminder before we begin that to the audience that you can send questions for Larry at any point during our discussion. You know I'm sure you all know the drill now. There's a Q&A function at the very bottom right of your screen. You can send questions anytime. In the meantime, I have quite a few questions of my own. And I'd like to start, maybe Larry, if we could, with the title of this lecture, Stranger in a Strange Land. As descriptions go, is that about the right one of where you are at the moment?
I think it's accurate, because even though I've lived here now for coming on 2 years, even after I would have lived here for 20 years, and I've had from colleagues who've been in the DC press corps for a long time, they just feel that they're only coming to beginning to understand America and all its contradictions and all its differences. And in the ways that you think you understand someone and then you don't, or you think, fine, every single Black person in America supports Black Lives Matter, but that's not, because you will see actual Black people at Stop the Steal events, people who believe that President Trump was robbed of this election, who fly the thin blue line flag. So you must have seen the thin blue line, which is the flag of the United States, and just the colors are just black, blue, and white, and it's got this thin blue line running across it, which is in support of law enforcement and often seem to be in opposition to Black Lives Matter. And you would think that any Black person in this country would want a right to exist and not be shot by the police. But there's people on the opposite side of Black Lives Matter who think it's missing the mark, and that the bigger problem about Black lives is all the Black on Black crime, and they will make a very strong argument for it. So I think it's accurate to say I'm a stranger in a strange land, even though I have many American friends. I went to grad school here. I'm still only beginning to understand it, and at the same time trying to translate it for the rest of the world.
Mm-hmm. And that is the role that you see for yourself as translator, you've said in the past. I wonder, we're all quite accustomed to watching international correspondents who are either of or at least born in the West, covering international events on Western networks like BBC and CNN. And we rarely think of or see African correspondents in this role of covering the West for a global audience. How do you see your role so far, in particular, as an argument for changing that?
I think, to the BBC's credit, they picked a random African from Kenya to come and cover the US. And it just so turned out that this was especially a year in which my perspective was useful in helping broaden the perspectives that we have on our air. And I think what eventually this says as a statement is that people come from different backgrounds. People come into journalism from all sorts of places in the world, and they all have a valid right to cover every part of the world. Part of it is just access to the opportunities to cover, especially the West, are so limited. Even within the BBC, covering North America is one of those things that you eventually work your way up to, and very few people, a lot of people want it, and not that many people get it. Even though we have 14 correspondents covering the US, just because of how big it is and how big the BBC is. I would love to have more people that look like me, not necessarily from Africa, from everywhere else in the world, people of color, regardless of where they're from, cover every part of the world. Somebody from Asia to cover Mexico, and somebody from Brazil covering India, and moving around, because I think it helps broaden our understanding of the world when people come in with fresh eyes and not always a Western lens. And I'm especially aware of this because, as somebody who came up in the African media, I was very critical of the way that we as Africans were caricatured by Western correspondents parachuting in and basically trying to explain us to the world in shorthand based on our stereotypes and our worst moments, and completely ignoring the nuance that exists in a place that you've only been for a week. So I hope that when I cover this country, I'm not trying to fall back to stereotypes and fall back to the easy understanding, because that's what foreign correspondents are supposed to do. You go somewhere, you spend a couple of weeks, and then you're on to the next one. There's a much need for deeper understanding and nuanced coverage of some of the more complex issues in the world. And regardless of the reporter's background, the reporter's skin color, everybody should be just have an equal chance.
Mm-hmm. Of course, you, as you mentioned in your remarks, you know the U.S. You studied there for at least a couple of years, I understand, and you're familiar with the culture, all of that stuff. I wonder what you do. What is your strategy for avoiding falling into that trap? As you say, when journalists are parachuted into a culture that they don't know as well as, let's say, the average American reporter, even with the knowledge that you have. What are your strategies? What do you rely on to avoid that?
I think part of it, one of the things I love to do, and America is the size of a continent. So I just got back from North Dakota, which is so far up north, is essentially Canada. And they now have this tiny US state, which has the population of North Dakota is smaller than San Francisco County. They have about 750,000 people. Yet they had, when I was there, the highest number of coronavirus cases, the highest number of coronavirus deaths. And everybody we spoke to, like, you're from the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation, and you're here talking about North Dakota. Why? But they don't understand how much there's a global interest in their story, because they have become this tiny COVID capital of America. And it's easy to reduce them to, well, this is rural country. There's more cows there's more cattle than people in North Dakota. And that's true. And I had that in my story. But it's a lot more complicated than that. And I try and make sure that I have an understanding of them. I speak to the people. I will read the local press. I will listen to the local media. And what is the quintessential North Dakota way? What are they trying to convey? Why is it that this is happening here? And I will be the first to tell you that we're not always 100% successful. And sometimes you're on a deadline and you do a less than perfect job. But I'm aware. I know, because I've lived this experience. I've been in places. I've been as an African watching my country and my people described. And I was just like, that's not who we are. That's actually very basic, and that's sometimes factually incorrect. But I didn't have a way to correct that. I didn't have a way to go up against a huge Western media machine. But now that I am part of this Western media machine, I've spent so much time criticizing. I have to be aware of my own biases and my own ways to try and understand some things that are complex and reduce them to a soundbite, because often it needs a lot more than a soundbite.
So I'd like to get into all of that in more detail, but I thought it'd be kind of nice to hear a little bit more about your beginnings and how it is that you ended up at the BBC. So I thought I'd like to go back to your mention of the fact that you actually wanted to be a missionary priest at what point. Is there any sense in which you're playing that role now as a journalist?
Wow, it is journalism is very far from from the ministry of the word of the Lord, and like I said,
but there's a confessional aspect to it. There's a salvational role, perhaps. Is there anything to that?
Will journalism save the world? I think not. We will take a good stab at it, and having been all over the world as well, that you try and bring some light to, I guess, complex issues and to complex people, and help the world understanding of these often forgotten corners of the world. So in a way, I am a missionary, I guess, because I go to different places and I listen to people and I try and say what they're saying. And sometimes some of the most fascinating conversations I've had are with people who, for instance, didn't believe in wearing masks, and like, why don't you want to wear a mask? It's like, I remember this one young man told me, I think the coronavirus is man-made, and so I think it's not real, and I don't need to be made to wear a mask. And I remember telling him, you do realize that North Dakota has the highest number of coronavirus cases in the world? It's like, oh, I didn't know that. Really? It's like, yeah, and you also have the highest number of deaths per capita. I'm like, oh, that's fascinating. And we were not yelling at each other. I met him at a diner, and we were just having a conversation, and thought that was so fascinating that he had very strongly held views, but he didn't always have all the facts supporting it. And when he's presented with a new set of facts, like, okay, that's interesting.
Do you think you changed his mind?
No. Which is why I would have failed as a missionary.
I want to go even further than that. You had a very difficult childhood, and I wanted to know how that story shapes the way you tell stories today.
I have seen a lot of hardship. I have come from, I didn't imagine at some point in my life being able to move to Nairobi, the capital of Kenya, and just to have a house in Nairobi was seen as a huge achievement, because in the west of the country where I'm from, it's not a dream that a lot of people had, at least to have a decent job where you had a salary and all that. But I think the fact that my mother told me and taught me about the world, and especially instilled in me that I could be anything I wanted to be, I think has informed my world. But it has also given me a certain empathy when I deal with people who are not as privileged as I've become since in life. I try and make sure that I represent that, and I do right by them. I've had the misfortune, I guess, of losing both my parents when I was pretty young. By the time I was 14, I lost both my parents. And it has taught me about the kindness that exists in the world, because I wouldn't be doing any of this unless other people took an interest in me and offered to support me and give me a chance. And I'm still grateful to everybody who's been part of my journey into journalism, into the BBC, into my current role. It's just been a whole lot of people in my path who have paved the way and given me open doors and given me opportunities.
Mm-hmm. But when you go and tell the stories of people that you meet along the way, where does that figure into the process? I mean, does it make you a bit more open to listening to people's stories and origins?
I think the one thing it has taught me is that everybody's got a story, and when you see them and you try and judge them based on their appearance, and when you actually begin to listen to them, there will be a lot more multi-layered than they let on, because you might see somebody who's got, I don't know, tattoos and all this kind of goth look, and you're like, okay, I think I understand this person. And often you have a conversation with them, they have the most tenderest of hearts, they're very kind, they're considerate and all that. And just the outward appearance doesn't show any of that. I think in what I do now, people might imagine that I've had a lot of privilege growing up, and it's opened all these doors for me, until they actually get to talk to me. It's like, okay, he comes from an interesting place, and I think he's come a long way, and he's going a lot further. But that doesn't mean that people in my village are impressed by me. I come from a village that neighbors the village of President Obama, and where his dad is from. So I'm not even the most accomplished person in my own village in Western Kenya. And not too far from there, in the neighboring county, is where Lupita Nyong'o is from, who's won an Oscar. So like,
Wow.
oh, you work for the BBC?
Stiff competition.
Yeah, our son was the president of the US and has won an Oscar and all these other things. So yeah, I mean, you're okay.
Yeah. Now, to go back to your history as a journalist in Kenya, while you were working there, you once slept overnight in what you call a safe house to evade arrest by the government. Can you tell us that story? Why did that happen?
All right. So in 2000, I want to say that was 2013, the most recent Kenyan election.
Yeah.
We have a long history of contested elections. It's just something that we tend to do, which is in the last election, we actually did it twice because the first election was actually thrown out by the Supreme Court of Kenya because they had too many irregularities. The winner could not be told. And when the second election happened, Raila Odinga, one more time, the same guy from 2007 who declared he had won, he again declared that he won the election, even though the current president, Uhuru Kenyatta, also said that he won the election. And so what happened is that Raila Odinga decided to hold a parallel swearing-in ceremony away from the swearing in that President Kenyatta had done. And we thought this was something that was newsworthy that we needed to cover. I was working for a Kenyan TV station at the time. This is 2017, not 2013. I was working for a Kenyan TV station at the time, and we decided we were going to go live around this. We were going to build some programming on it, and this was something that had immense public interest that we needed to bring to our viewers. The government took a different view for national security reasons. They declared that this was an event that was banned, and we should not be covering it. And what ended up happening is we got it on good authority that there was plainclothes officers from a feared arm of the Kenyan police that is known for enforced disappearances. They arrest people and often they are never to be heard from again, and their bodies end up getting found in forests and places like those. And they were camped outside our office and they wanted to arrest me and two of my colleagues. And we had to take all sorts of precautions. We spent the first night actually at the newsroom just to make sure that we didn't leave the building. We ended up switching off our phones, escaped through the basement of the company and went into a safe house as we tried to find a way to block the government from arresting us. And what is eventually ended up happening is we got what is called anticipatory bail, which essentially says that I have reason to believe that I'm about to be arrested by the police and I'm a law-abiding citizen, I'm not a flight risk. And if they were to present a case against me in a court of law, I will show up. And so I'm preemptively blocking the police from arresting me, which is not a thing I knew existed under Kenyan law, but it does. And we got that, and that's how we earned our freedom. And it's fascinating because President Trump now is considering a parallel event this January. Mercifully not be a swearing in like Raila Odinga's in Kenya, but he plans to announce his run for 2024 and will not be attending the swearing in of Joe Biden. So in some ways, I've come full circle.
Mm-hmm. Is that, I wonder how often that kind of experience is in the back of your mind while you're actually covering the US election?
I think it has taught me that journalism in other parts of the world can be quite difficult. And I fully understand, and I say this openly, that I sold out. I took a job with the BBC where there's a lot more protections for what I do, that I'm better protected, I'm better compensated than I ever did working for Kenyan TV. And yet my colleagues that work in the African media work under very difficult circumstances with very little support, where sometimes they're threatened, where their families are threatened. And sometimes in some countries, they're killed just for doing their job. And often they don't get attention because they don't work for any major international news agencies. And so they're quickly forgotten. And yet they do an important job in holding the governments accountable, in presenting, in holding power to account in ways that we could only imagine because we don't cover the minutiae of every country. But those reporters are working for small radio stations, community radio stations, small newspapers in their communities do a much finer job of journalism, and they're much better journalists than I can ever hope to be.
I know you joke about it being a selling out, but I wonder what it is that I mean, clearly a part of you believes that's somewhat true, but I wonder what the payoff is, and I'm not talking about salary here.
I think one of the things that's been really inspiring for me is hearing from a lot of other African reporters who said, seeing you do this has told me that even I can do this, that we feel represented and we feel seen. And it's a power representation that I never thought that I stood in for anybody else other than just myself getting this great opportunity. And coming here and doing this past few years and realizing how few of us there are, people who look like me, who report for foreign agencies. And I remember a friend of mine, I just saw the announcement that he's coming to be a North America correspondent for ITV in the UK. And I was so happy for him because he came from an underprivileged background as a Black man growing up in London. And he's got this great opportunity. And it's like, okay, I realize now that this is such an important thing because there are so few opportunities for people that look like us to be in these positions. So I might not be holding power to account back at home in Kenya, but I think in ways that I'm still helping people understand this part of the world and standing in the gap in a way, I think that's useful in its own way.
It is useful. And as you say, these perspectives are critical, especially as we sort of witness these massive shifts in this sort of geopolitical environment. Given your experiences in the US so far, if you had to write a short headline to reflect the US today, what would that headline be?
Oh, wow. American exceptionalism, question mark. Because I think that image of American exceptionalism has been shattered this past few years, but especially this past few weeks with this chaotic election and its outcome and the uncertainty about what happens next and the systematic undermining of institutions, the denigration of what is fact, the process by which everything that doesn't agree with me does not exist and I refuse to acknowledge it, I think has just been astounding for me watching it. And for somebody who grew up in a part of the world where America was seen as the beacon of democracy, as a shining light for what's right and what's proper and what's appropriate, and in many ways, the U.S. has walked away from that role in the world, and it's become much more insular because of America First, because of all the different decisions that have been taken over the past 4 years, and it will take some time to try and rebuild that trust, rebuild that. I think rebuild that credibility around the world and not just in Africa.
Question mark is the interesting addition to that phrase, because you also raised a number of questions in a report that you did in Atlanta leading up to the 2020 election to ask the question, is democracy in the US at stake? I wonder how far you think you got in actually answering that question.
I think it's a big topic, and the way how you slice and dice it, you can do it in so many different ways. It felt like it was a stake in the run up to the election, and I heard from at least 2 different organizations that were planning for a coup. They were planning for nonviolent means in case there was a coup. Again, that's not a word I thought you'd ever hear in reference to an American election, and yet it's a word that was coming up all the time. And for the record, it's not just a coup in the sense that President Trump refusing to leave office. It was a coup in the sense that some people feared that Joe Biden might declare himself president, even though he had not won. And both were equally concerning to people who were preparing for this situation. And at least from one organization shut down DC, they said, if President Trump tries to steal this election, this organizer told me, we will rise up and we will be out on the streets to make sure that he doesn't do that. And again, the phrase steal an election was not something that I thought would be heard in reference to the American election. It's interesting that that's a word and that's a phrase that's now been adopted by the GOP, by President Trump's base, that they feel this election was stolen. And he keeps going back to this narrative about the fact that there was such widespread voter fraud that it should invalidate the election. He just gave another 46-minute video on his Facebook page today where he wants all the election results in the swing states to be thrown out. And I remember we've had this conversation at the BBC about how to characterize what's happening and how do we describe it to our viewers who don't follow the ins and outs of every day. And the American media going with baseless claims of voter fraud. Because we're the BBC and we try to be impartial, but also clear in how we explain the world, we've decided to go with the word unsubstantiated. So when he says that there was widespread voter fraud, we're telling our audiences that we have not seen any supporting evidence of that, and these are unsubstantiated claims. And yet this has a job of undermining trust in the process, undermining people's trust in the democratic process, but specifically in elections. And you're starting to see some of the impact of that again in Georgia, where they have 2 runoffs for Senate seats in Georgia, but there's a growing number of Republicans who have been told so much about how the process was corrupt, even though it was not, that they don't think they should vote again in the election on January 5th because they just don't trust it. Because if it's going to be stolen anyway, why should we bother?
It's interesting to listen to some of the words you're using, coup and rigged and stolen. And of course, we've been watching the elections, all of us from over here. I do want to sort of reference a little bit, that was something that was mentioned in the comments leading up to your talk. You know, the US is obviously not at war, but you could argue that what you were covering is a conflict of sorts, and you still are. And if it is a conflict, if you agree with that statement at some level, then how would you describe the front line?
Wow. I think this is certainly a conflict. It's a conflict in the way, in the war of words, the conflict of ideas, but it's also in the conflict in the differing visions of this country. And the front lines of this is played out in the misinformation angle, which is something that people talk about big tech censoring conservative voices, or Facebook and Twitter having too much of an influence. But what people misunderstand, or what people kind of lose track of, is that America has become so polarized. The hyperpolarization that's taken over this country is to such an extent that I only seek out information that agrees with me. Part of it is confirmation bias, and we all suffer from it. But taken to an extreme is where I will not agree on any set of facts if these facts are inconvenient to me. And so I will seek out only people who agree with me. And one of the ways this manifests itself is in Fox News declaring, they declared pretty early, more than before any other organization, that Joe Biden had won Arizona. And it was 2-3 days later before any of the other major American agencies also called Arizona for Joe Biden. And then when they called their presidency for Joe Biden, there's been a migration of their core viewers who can no longer watch Fox News because they think Fox News has become too liberal. And they're moving to Newsmax, they're moving to One American News Network, which, if you watch the coverage, is very much misinformation. They live in this alternate reality where the election has not been called and where President Trump still has a chance of winning. And they are spinning these baseless conspiracy theories about election fraud, about affidavits, about a very good chance of the election lawsuits that President Trump's team is filing, that they could go anywhere. Then they're getting thrown out by judges all across the country, many of them Trump-appointed judges. But it's comfort food for people who do not want to live in this America where Joe Biden is going to be president in 50 or so days. And that's the same thing that's also reflected in their social media feeds on Facebook, where they follow Breitbart and they follow Dan Bongino and they follow all these conservative voices, Mike Levin and Rush Limbaugh, who are telling them what they want to hear and completely ignoring anything else. And it's not just in the political sphere, it's in the misinformation about the virus. There's a lot of problems right now with the vaccine about to come out for coronavirus, that there's just not enough confidence in people who have started this process. I remember speaking to Bill Gates, that would be 2 months ago, and asking him what he thought about so many theories about him, conspiracy theories about how he's trying to implant a chip in everyone, and how he is part of this cabal led by George Soros and other people who are trying to program the entire world. And obviously it's completely made up, but it's being repeated so many times that people are starting to believe it. And like, you all remember the pandemic video that Facebook and YouTube and everybody kept taking down and kept reappearing and getting shared on WhatsApp and on other social networks. So I think the front lines of this war is not in the typical people who are taking arms, but in misinformation, which is much harder to put out because it's often hard to tell where it's coming from. Or if the major platforms, Facebook and Twitter and YouTube, kick you out, you're just going to go to alternative ones like 4chan and Parler and other places where they have no way to verify or to regulate what you're saying.
But it is kind of a conflict that's unfolding across the world. What makes you feel, or what have you observed to kind of suggest that it's sharper in the United States than elsewhere?
I've seen this, the biggest social network in Africa, for instance, is not Facebook or Twitter, it's WhatsApp, because all our aunties are sharing all the conspiracy theories they got from their church friend. And then this really gets a way of getting around pretty quickly. And it's like, oh, you should be afraid because 5G is what's killing us. And the coronavirus came from 5G. And then they'll throw a Bible verse down there. So it must be true because it says this in Titus 13 or whatever. And it's been used to spread hate and misinformation and to, in some ways, try to influence elections. But when you apply it at scale in the way that it works in the US, I think it's dangerous. It's got a way to program a large segment of the population pretty quickly. And I know this is dangerous because I have to move, I have to leave my library. And one of the women that met trying to rent from her for a house, and she was telling me, this is literally yesterday, she's like, so there's a vaccine coming which has got 95% efficacy, right? It's 95% effective, but what's the survival rate of coronavirus? 99.9%. This is not true, but that's what she told me. So why are we being given a 95% effective vaccine for a disease that's 99% survivable? I mean, think about it. But they've all told us to be afraid and scared. And she was saying these things very seriously, that I was worried that she's somebody who's well-educated, somebody who's sophisticated, but she does believe this because she's seen it on a Facebook page somewhere and it's been shared, and it must be true.
I'd like to get a sense of what your personal experience has been like actually covering the story on the ground in the United States. And I want to go back to an example that you've talked about previously in the past when you were reporting live once. I believe it was from an area where there were Trump supporters rallying, and your producers in London were worried about your safety and were sort of telling you to leave. Can you paint the scene for us and tell us what happened there?
All right, so this was maybe 2 days after the election. It had been called for Joe Biden. There were celebrations all across the nation, and I was outside the Georgia State Capitol in Atlanta, where there was another Stop the Steal event. Pro-Trump supporters saying this election had been rigged, it had been stolen. There was a computer software that was made to deliberately glitch and add votes to Joe Biden, and they wanted the whole thing thrown out. And we had done a pre-interview with this one man who was happy to talk to us. Most of them generally distrust the media because President Trump has sowed so much distrust, called the media the enemy of the people, called it the fake news. And so people generally see with a camera, they don't want to talk to you. And often it's quite hostile. But this one man agreed. And so we had a great conversation. When we went on the air, and I was like, so why are you here? And he threw the question back to me, why are you here? And I said, well, I'm here to cover your event and to bring a spotlight to it. It's like, exactly, that's why we're here. We're here to bring scrutiny to this injustice that has been carried out. And as we kept talking, several other people started yelling at us and saying we were trying to misinform people. Why am I asking him leading questions? Why am I being subjective? And it became quite hectic that we eventually ended up cutting short the interview and handing back to studio. And I remember producers both in London and DC calling saying, are you guys safe out there? Because it looks quite volatile and we can't see any sort of security there. And the extra layer to this, which is not always apparent on camera, is that many of these people are armed. They're armed, and this is sometimes they come from open carry states. There's a lot more guns in this country, almost more guns than people. And when they gather, there will be counter protesters from the other side, often who are also armed. And it becomes difficult to tell when this will degenerate to the point where there might be people fighting or people worse shooting at each other. And there's been militia on other streets in other cities. So we determined at least at that point that we were safe enough because there were police around us. But there have been instances in other places where we didn't feel safe enough. We thought this was going to degenerate. We thought this was going to be break down into a war, and we don't want to be here when that happens. And the extra part of it is also, I often stand out in places like these. In this one event, I was one of maybe 2 or 3 black faces there. So it places an extra unnecessary target on your back.
So what is that like when you go up with your microphone and your camera to some of these supporters to ask questions? What's the reaction that you get?
Usually, I'll be honest, because they know I have an accent, so I'm clearly not from here. And like, oh, you're from the BBC? That's interesting. We've heard that on NPR or on PBS. They're much more willing to talk to us because we're not an American outlet. That because I'm not an American, they think we'll do a much better job of telling their story than the American press, because of the way the polarization is permeated almost every aspect of media, that liberals only read the Times and watch CNN, MSNBC, and conservatives are on Fox and the Wall Street Journal and whatnot. And the two sides are not talking to each other. So sometimes it's easier to work as a reporter when you're not from here because they feel you give them a fair shake.
Going back to the idea of conflicts, as conflicts go, perhaps the most significant that continues to linger and has been around for a long time in the United States is the one over race, which you referenced. What was it like, or what is it like being a Black man, an African man, covering this story in the United States?
I think for the most part, when I walk down the street, I'm just another Black man walking down the street. And that means that I'm aware of my Blackness in instances where I have a driver's license. If I was driving and I was pulled over by police, I would fear for my life, genuinely, because I've seen too many of those videos, and there are people who are getting shot who look like me. And that's something that stays with you. There are places where there are microaggressions that apply to you that regardless of who you are and what you do, that you're reduced to the color of your skin and found unworthy. I remember one time, the weekend that President Trump was in the hospital with COVID, and I was anchoring our breaking news, and we were on the air for hours. And I remember walking out of the BBC and going to a CVS, a drugstore, and I don't know what I was looking for, and being followed down the aisles and back and forth. And like, this doesn't happen to everyone, but this happens to people that look like me. because the assumption is you must be trying to steal something, maybe trying to steal Advil or some pain medication. So there are ways that I think America still reminds you of the color of your skin, and in ways that sometimes can be very disconcerting. I remember when I first moved out here, I went to dinner at a friend's house on the Upper West Side in New York, in the really rich neighborhood. And this is somebody who has won a major global award. The wife is just equally accomplished, and they have a fancy loft, penthouse in this part of the city. And when I came into the front door, and I was carrying something as a gift for, you don't show up at people's houses empty-handed. And the doorman sent me to the back door, to the back of the building, to use the service entrance, because he thought I was a delivery guy, because you can only be a delivery guy. This important white people can't have a black guest who come in for dinner. And so I was amused by it. My friend was mortified, because it's like, my racist doorman did not think that you were coming to dinner with us. So it's not even in my reporting, but it's in everyday life that reminds you of the very fractured nature of this country, but also in the ways that sometimes I think is almost unconscious, the discrimination in the ways that exists. But like I mentioned, when I've been to too many of these Black Lives Matter protests here in DC, in Philly, in New York, in Dallas, and all across the nation, when you hear the stories of people who were pulled over by police and discriminated against, and when you hear of the heartbreak, or when you hear of somebody who was killed for Elijah McClain, for instance, the kindest of people from all the descriptions of him, and he was still shot dead. Like, these people look like me. This could be me. This could be my cousin. This could be my brother. And it really brings a level of, it brings us so much closer than anybody who would report on this from a level of remove.
Mm-hmm. So how do you bring your perspective and yourself, your experiences, to your reporting in the era of Black Lives Matter?
I think it's a difficult plank to walk. It's a delicate balance between, I'm not an activist and I don't want to be an activist. I just want to make sure that we're telling the right stories. But also, this is my lived experience as somebody who's Black and male in this country. And I hope that it brings that nuance to viewers, especially who don't understand how serious of a problem this is, or who hear the counter arguments about, no, this is actually not that much of a problem. Actually, more white people are killed by police than Black people, which is true. However, per capita, more Black people are killed by police than any other race in the United States. Just there are 13% of the population that's Black in the US, and they account for the largest percentage of police shootings in the US than any other country. So that's not something that's in contest. And I think that's something that needs to appear in our coverage more. And we must make sure that we're explaining how complex this is. I spoke to the Reverend R. Sharpton, who has been a campaigner on these issues for a long time. He was talking about Amadou Diallo in 1999. Amadou Diallo was the son of Guinean immigrants and was shot dead by police in New York in 1999. And it's not changed since then. And bringing that background and perspective to it, the family is still mourning this young man who was killed in 1999. And yet it's very similar to George Floyd today, similar to Brianna Taylor, similar to some. They're not just statistics, and I think it's useful to some context to how these stories affect families. Who are these people? Who was Brianna Taylor? What did she mean to her family? What were her dreams? What was she like in everyday life?
So many more questions to ask, but I'm going to skip through a little bit because we do have quite a few audience questions, but I do have a couple more just to ask you very quickly. I want to go back to just quickly the idea of voter suppression that you covered and your views on that, but not only that, but also the views of your nearly 2 million Twitter followers who follow every word and every report you make. And judging from their reaction, they had the same kind of thinking and reaction to what goes through your mind when you looked at voter suppression and how it was viewed and how it's practiced in the US. Can you elaborate on what the effect is for parts of the world that have been lectured by the State Department or US embassies or other arms of the US government to watch that kind of thing unfold in real time, on international television?
I think the memes coming out of Africa about this election the campaign and the aftermath have been hilarious, because Africans are just like, we've been there and we can teach you a thing or two. And one of the things, for instance, have been people saying, have you considered a coalition government? You can make President Trump prime minister, Biden can be president, you can expand the cabinet so everybody gets a position, we can all be at brunch by Saturday. Because that's often the African solution to a contested election, is just create more positions, create a prime minister, the ceremonial, and the president, and every major politician gets a cabinet post, and everybody's happy until the next election, and then it's all contested again. But beyond that, I think the word that best describes the reaction from the rest of the world that's been elected is the German word Schadenfreude, which is essentially joy at somebody else's misfortune. Because the lack of self-awareness they feel in the way America has lectured them about democracy, rule of law, about the peaceful transfer of power, about democratic institutions, have all been appended by this year, have all been contradicted by the actions and developments in the US. And they just still can't imagine that the US continues to put out these statements that are completely lacking in self-awareness, that are completely without a hint of irony, unaware of how the rest of the world sees what's happening here, is just shaking their heads and finding it so messy and so underwhelming. So the rest of the world is laughing at the US. That's the simple way to put it, because they never thought this was the country that would be having these sort of problems, where every day it's a new tweet, every day it's a new twist and turn, and every day it's a fight against the basic facts. It's left is right, up is down, and you never know what next is going to come. It's been truly bizarre. Even for those of us who are covering it, sometimes we just can't believe the amount of craziness that's coming at us.
How do you suspect the world's media would be covering this kind of story had it been unfolding in some country in the global south?
I have two friends who've written about this beautifully. One is Karen Attia, the Washington Post, and she recently had a post out there about how the rest of the world would cover what's happening in America. If it was in another country, they would talk about the Trump regime refusing to accept the will of the people, the prospect of violence. They would talk about in lots of stereotypical, caricatured terms. And it's just because America has control of the global media and is the center of media internationally that you don't see that sort of shorthand for all of the ways this has appended long-held conventions. The second friend who's also written a little about this is Patrick Gadara in Kenya, who did this viral post that was viewed more than 50,000 times, just talking about the way the American media would be covering what's happening here if it happened in anywhere in part of the world. So I highly recommend Karen Attia's writing on this in the Washington Post, and Patrick Gadara, Gathara, he's written about this in Al Jazeera. He's written about this for other outlets. That's just so fascinating.
Just the last couple of things from me is of course, and know that journalism is under attack, that credibility is a huge problem, as you mentioned, not just in the US, but in many other places, the infodemics, the plandemic, information ecospheres. Do you ever sort of get as a sense in your deepest, darkest moments that maybe the game is lost?
I hope not. I think I still know too many reporters who are trying to do their best under often extraordinary circumstances, and sometimes without the right support, who are trying to make sure that people are informed, who are trying to present the best obtainable version of the truth. And will they make mistakes sometimes? Absolutely, but who doesn't? And when they do, they're honest enough to correct it and try and strive to do better. And they are the last line of defense against a complete deluge of misinformation, where people will be free to believe in only what agrees with them and discount everything else. In some ways, it looks like we're very close to that, to the extent that people right now just want opinions, that want facts, that reinforce their stereotypes, reinforce their beliefs, and nothing else. And I know colleagues of mine here in the US, in the UK, and around the world who are trying to make sure that, you know what, I know this isn't convenient for you, but this is how the facts are. And I've been encouraged by their reporting and how much work they put into it, how much effort they put into their work to make sure that, if for nothing else, for historical record, when people look back on this time and this period in our life, they will find an accurate account of events, they will find a truthful retelling of what went down, and they will use it for, I guess, to try and dig deeper into what was it like to live in 2020.
If you had to choose right now, what's the one story that you haven't covered that you want to tell from there?
Oh, wow. This is such a big country that it's difficult to pick one specific story that, one story that I never got to do is that Kanye West was running for president, and I was really keen to try and speak to him and interview him, but he didn't know, he did one launch event to announce his campaign, and then he never really showed up anywhere. He was only on the ballot in 12 states. He didn't have a team. He did have a snappy video, but that's it. We reached out to his team and consistently saying, hey, when is he next holding an event? We'd love to come and cover it. We'd like to interview him, and we didn't hear back. So I'm a little disappointed in Kanye West. Could have been the president we never had. So maybe easy 2024.
Maybe 2024, I was just going to say. Well, that's a good way to segue to the audience questions. Thank you very much for answering mine, or just a small portion of mine. Here's a question from Deborah Okoth. I think I'm saying that. A Kenyan
that's somebody from a village.
There you go. A Kenyan graduate student at Carleton University. What lessons did you learn from the US elections that could apply in Kenyan context, specifically the role of the media? What role does the media play in the credibility of an election? Great question.
So Okoth, this goes back to part of the reason why the Kenyan election was contested in 2007 is there was an accusation that the media in Kenya helped fan the flames of violence. And we know this going back historically to 1994. And how the radio was such a powerful tool for fanning the flames that eventually led to the genocide in 1994. And part of it is the use of the language. Cockroaches was such a loaded term that was being used on the radio in Rwanda. And in 2007, especially among vernacular radio, we have 43 different people in Kenya who speak 43 different languages. And within the language, the radio stations that speak to those specific people, I'm deliberately not using the word tribe, within the vernacular stations that speak to them, there was a way coded language that was teaching them, or in some ways, I believe, almost advising them to rise up against their opponents. And one of the people who eventually ended up in front of the International Criminal Court was a journalist with one of these radio stations. So that's something that's always at the back of my mind about how powerful the media is. In some ways, there was a lot more restraint in this election, at least among the American media. But there's also sometimes what people see as over censorship. Just in the last 24 hours, Project Veritas, which is hugely discredited, has put out this video of what they claim are CNN's 9 a.m. Editorial meetings where they determine what they're going to cover and what they're not going to cover. And they are essentially saying, as a conservative-leaning outlet, that CNN is deliberately censoring conservative voices and trying to paint this election in favor of Joe Biden. So that's a criticism that always exists. I think with great power comes great responsibility, and that's always useful in every context, whether here in the US, in Kenya, or elsewhere, because the media is a mirror to society, but also it's in how that society sees itself, and what you amplify often has an effect of, depending on what it is, what you amplify can help radicalize the entire society. And it might be intentional, it might be unconscious, but it's still just as powerful and just as dangerous.
Well, just a quick follow to that is, when do you feel the heaviest weight of the responsibility? When does that weigh on you most?
When the heaviest weight of the responsibility, I think, is when there's the greatest contestation, when the emotions are highest, when the divisions are greatest. Then that's when you need to be even most responsible, because any careless word, any careless bulletin or broadcast has potential to really charge things, and could be the difference between an all-out war or people keeping peace.
Mm-hmm. Here's another question. In what ways do you think international coverage, like the BBC's, has differed from mainstream US news that most Americans are watching this year?
I watch a lot of American news, and we're obviously quite different. One, we're a public service broadcaster as the BBC, so we don't spend the whole day, if you watch the BBC or listen to the BBC World Service, we don't have pundits on hour after hour disagreeing and yelling at each other the whole day. And that's the preferred model of American television. It's just endless pundits. And if they're Fox commentators, they're all saying the same things the audience wants to hear. If they're MSNBC commentators, they're saying the same things that the audience wants to hear. And that's why I call it comfort food. You're not watching anything that's challenging to you. You're not watching anything that's likely to be in disagreement with what you already believe. And I think what the BBC does brilliantly is help people understand their world and bring in challenging perspectives and bring both sides of an argument. And we don't help you decide. We will bring in the perspectives and help you, and you will have to make up your own decision. Ironically, the tagline of Fox News for the longest time used to be fair and balanced, when the coverage was anything but.
Okay, well, I just want to barrel through a few of these because there's quite a few really good ones. What does Larry think about citizen journalism today and its role in making conflict so accessible to a global audience?
So I think citizen journalism is just such a powerful tool for stories, especially that are not covered by the mainstream media because of incompetence or because they just don't think that's going to rate well, or for any other reasons. Unfortunately, citizen journalism often doesn't go through the same layers of fact checking and gatekeeping that traditional media will go through. And so it's easy to broadcast a rumor. As Mark Twain said, a lie gets halfway around the world while the truth is still putting on its shoes. And sometimes citizen journalists who are running after just virality or shares or clicks will run with the narrative that's convenient just because it's going to get the audience charged up, and the facts are often secondary to that. So while it's a powerful tool, I think it needs a great level of responsibility. What I've seen happen in some countries is just lots of regulation, which doesn't work because then it's no longer free. I believe in free flow of information, but those that have this tool, like I said before, with great power comes great responsibility.
What is a positive story Larry covered in the US? Something that he saw as hopeful, promoting societal cohesion, or countering hatred in society?
Oh, wow. I think we don't have any one set of stories that this is all the negative stories we're going to cover. We've done all sorts of fun stories. I'm trying to think of any specific one. Part of the reason is because of COVID, there've been very limited deployments. The BBC, like lots of other media outlets, want us to limit our travel as much as possible, and we're only deploying when we absolutely must, so that we're going out there to tell stories that are critical, that help our audience better understand their world and the US specifically. So I can't think of something specifically, but if you look through any half-hour broadcast, even on BBC World News America, we'll always try and end with something lighter, something uplifting. And that's the same of our coverage of the US.
But have you seen anything just in your travels, something somebody has said, or somebody doing something that gives you some sort of some hope or some positivity?
So many, absolutely. I think especially in this COVID period with so many people out of work, so many people, there's just been Thanksgiving where there's been so much volunteering, there's been so much charity, neighbors helping neighbors, giving them food, giving them turkeys. Nearly 50 million people are facing hunger in America right now, which is unprecedented. And when you see how much donations are going out there with long lines, you saw Tyler Perry, for instance, in Atlanta bought Thanksgiving food for something like 5,000 families in the area, and that was a big boost for them. So there's been so many stories like those all across the states, which has been, I think, for me, so it speaks to the American spirit that despite all of the many flaws this country has, on the basic level, they're mostly very nice people.
Here's a question from an American graduate of Carleton University School of International Affairs. He says, or she, I'm not sure, I'm curious to hear your insights on the role of religion in US politics and the country in general.
Oh, religion plays a very big role here. I remember being in the Carolinas. I was in Greenville, which is up in South Carolina, and Greenville is the most conservative part of a very conservative state. And all the people I spoke to were very deeply religious people who told me, you know what, President Trump believes what I believe in. He's appointed conservative judges. He believes he's a nice Christian man, and that's why I support him, because he represents faith in the White House, and that's the kind of leader I want. So I think religion is so important here, and especially evangelicals are such a prized part of the American political system, and who they support and who they vote for. They're a big voting bloc. But what's also been surprising for me is I'm a Christian from the other side of the world, and the brand of conservative, the brand of evangelicalism, or the evangelical Christianity in the American sense, that many of whom are pro-gun, many of whom are against abortion, and many of whom still say they preach the love of Jesus, but it's a very specific American custom-made Christianity that does not like anybody who is LGBTQIA, does not like, in some cases, people who don't look like them, where even speaking Spanish sometimes can be seen as a big offense. So it's a very specific kind of Christianity that sometimes is astounding to me, but also is a type of Christianity that's gained a lot of acceptance on the other side of the world, with Christians in the global south who watch these televangelists and who revere them and don't understand the linkages between conservatism and Christianity and the ways that they diverge from the established order of what the Bible says.
Okay. Here's a question all the way from Mombasa, from Isaiah.
Oh, Mombasa is beautiful. That's in the coast of Kenya.
Brilliant. He's asking what the future of American journalism post Donald Trump would be, considering the amount of discrediting that he's done to the American media.
I think that part of it is rebuilding. I've heard some colleagues privately claim it's going to be a much less interesting job because you won't see the deluge of tweets and bizarre statements and all of the drama that came with covering a former reality TV star turned president. And so in some ways, it's going to go back to boring. President Trump has given interviews to just about everybody, especially in conservative media. He has never been afraid to do one of these gaggles, either in the White House, on his way to the plane, in Air Force One. And that level of accessibility just will not exist with Joe Biden. He's going to be much more thoughtful. He's not going to give as many interviews. So to try and understand his administration's thinking on things, you're going to go back to the technocrats. And when they give these statements, I think they're going to be much more closely watched. So people who've made a name for themselves in tussling with President Trump for viral fame, I think they're in for a bit of a hard time in this new administration because you just want to see so many of those instances. But the work of telling the American story beyond the White House, beyond the Beltway, beyond Congress, I think that goes on. Local reporting is under attack in the US. There's a lot of local newspapers, local newsrooms that are running out of funding, that are shutting down. And so that's a real shame because lots of communities are becoming news deserts where they don't have a local newspaper or even a local website that covers specific issues to them.
This is more of a journalism-focused question, personal question for you. What is it like to be an African correspondent in an international newsroom? And sort of as a follow-up, what can we do to push for diversity in global newsrooms?
Oh, wow. I've always wanted this question because I have all the solutions for how to fix diversity in every newsroom.
Great. We can all learn from you. Go ahead.
I know, Nahlah, this is why you're asking me these questions because I have all the answers. I wish I had an easy answer.
But what's it like? But what's it like? I mean, an international newsroom, but by nature, generally, I would suspect is far more diverse than national ones. Is that true?
It's very diverse, which is you'll find a lot of people from the UK and from Australia and from Ireland and from so there are not enough people that look like me. Unfortunately, it's a job that still needs to do a better job. There will be people, all sorts of accents, and all people from all sorts of backgrounds. Unfortunately, there's not that many. And listen, there's all sorts of Black people who come from Africa, from North America, from the Caribbean, from Europe. There's just not enough of us who are making it at the highest levels in international media.
So how does that affect how you navigate the newsroom? Like how does that affect your work?
I think it's something that I'm just acutely aware of how often I'm the only person that looks like me in meetings. I'm often the only person that looks like me in settings, and I have to make sure that when I come in as who I am, and I don't change my voice. My voice doesn't falter. I don't try and be somebody else to try and make anybody else feel more comfortable, because we just have to do a better job of representing ourselves and bring our perspectives to the table. And so that's not always easy, but I think it's useful work.
Mm-hmm. There's a follow-up to that question that I'd like to ask you, which is, you, as you mentioned repeatedly, you work for an organization that strives for impartiality and frowns kind of on opinions in news reporting. And in many newsrooms, including our own here at the CBC, there has been a reckoning on how the constraints of journalistic objectivity affects Black and Indigenous reporters and others of minority or people of color backgrounds. What's your sense on where the line should be drawn there?
I think this is something that all newsrooms struggle with, but especially those with a public service outlook like CBC or NPR here, PBS, and we at the BBC especially are struggling with it because we're just so big. And there's lots of people who feel that the BBC hasn't always done a good job of representing minority voices or covering our stories. And there was a big outrage a couple of weeks back where a correspondent used the N-word in a story because the family, they say, wanted that word used in the broadcast, in the story, and people were outraged. I was outraged because I just thought there was no place for that in the story that the BBC had put out for everybody to see. And I think out of that, there's been a review of the rules and a better understanding of when that's acceptable and when that's not, and when that needs to be necessarily referred up to management, referred up to senior editorial leaders to make sure that it doesn't fall through the cracks. So I think on some issues, there is no objectivity. As a Black man, would I like to be shot by police? Absolutely not. So do I support Black Lives Matter? The answer is I just want to live in a world where I'm not at risk because of the color of my skin. I know this has been an issue again for the BBC because there was some inaccurate reporting in the UK press that the BBC's new impartiality guidelines specifically blocked any LGBTQ BBC staff from going to Pride events. And again, that led to a lot of outrage because people felt the BBC should not have a right to tell people whether they can go to Pride events, and that was clarified. That's not actually, the rules don't say that. So because of this friction around what's objective and what's impartial and what can we do as newsrooms that haven't done a good job of being representative of people of color, of minorities, of people who are not represented in the main press, I think it's led to some review and some reckoning with both the outlook and the makeup of reporting editorial teams and leadership, but also in how specifically you cover these communities. For instance, a lot of American outlets are now capitalizing the B in Black, which was pushed by the National Association of Black Journalists. It's in small incremental developments like that.
Yeah, CBC is doing that as well. We're running out of time very quickly. Just a couple more questions
Really?
from
We've
the
only been
audience.
for 2 minutes.
We still have several more if you're willing. But
Sure.
This one's from Sarah Pledge Dixon, who's a Master's of Journalism student at Carleton as well. What is the responsibility of journalism to dispel false narratives? Among the spread of mis and disinformation, should we be giving everyone airtime?
Absolutely not. And so one of the things that's been happening lately with President Trump is a lot of the American media choosing not to either air press conferences or to pull out when they think that just the delusion of misinformation is overpowering. And that's been sometimes across the board, where Fox News, for instance, pulled away from a Kayleigh McEnany press conference, the White House spokesperson, which was unprecedented, that Neil Cavuto, this Fox News anchor, said, I can't in good conscience show you that because it's not true. It's not supported by fact. And I have a role to try and make sure that what we're presenting to you is at least factual. As this becomes a much bigger crisis, we have to be judicious in what we allow to have a platform, between fact checking it or being seen as promoting it. And it's not always clear. So I think there's a lot more thought that newsrooms and specific journalists have to weigh. If I fact check this, but I have to repeat the lie first to tell the truth, could that cause people who are not aware of it in the first place to then seek out more information about it and therefore mislead by accident? I don't have the easy answer for it.
We're going to go with one last question here, and it's this. It takes a lot of faith to continue doing the kind of work that you're doing. It's a high pressure job. It comes with a lot of responsibility. It has to really involve a real belief in your mission and its importance. Where does that faith stem from for you?
Oh, wow. That is, you're really waiting for the last question to be the hardest. I think what I do is such a privilege to be at this position at this time, to be have such a huge platform in which to tell stories. It's a massive privilege, and I want to make sure that I'm not wasting it, and two, that I'm taking great care in making sure that my stories are the best obtainable version of the truth. I know I've said that before, but I really believe it, whether it's in the facts that we put in the context that we add to it, in the choice of pictures, the choice of audio, and that it's a service to our audiences. And they expect a report from the BBC to be worth its weight and worth its name. And I don't want to feel like I'm the weak link in that. The other one is also just like, it's an important place to be at for everybody else from my home country, from my continent, who wants to get a chance to do this. And if I screw it up, then there will be a little less of an appetite for the next African to have another global role or outside of Africa, because like, oh yeah, those Africans, they will screw it up. So in some ways, I feel a responsibility for everybody else that I have to do a good job for, so that I don't mess up their chances. If both audiences, but also editorial leaders see that they're just as good as everybody else, then they will be much more open to opening up those purse strings and creating those opportunities and having everybody have an equal chance and equal shot at it. So that's why.
Larry Madowo, it's a real privilege to talk to you. Thank you so much for answering my questions and the questions from the audience, and apologies to all of those questions that we couldn't get to. And just a reminder that we will be running excerpts of this on CBC Ideas in the coming weeks. Thank you.
Exciting. Thank you for having me on your show, Nahlah. I've always wanted to be on your show. So this is it. I convinced Carleton to invite me just so I could become a CBC Ideas.
Brilliant. Brilliant. I'm thrilled. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Alan, back to you.
Thank you. Thank you both. Larry, Nahlah asked you for a headline earlier. Mine is wow, exclamation point. This has just been phenomenal. I wanted to live tweet throughout the evening, but I couldn't stop listening to you to do that. So thank you to you both. Thank you, Nahlah, for hosting. And
Pleasure.
We kind of get a double whammy because we get to listen again on ideas in the weeks ahead. So thank you for doing that. I also want to thank those who helped produce this event, the school's communications specialist, Jenna Lynn Smith, a photographer, John McGillis, who's been trying to make the most of how do you do photographs when we're stuck with Zoom images, and my friend and Zoom genius, Anne Blaney, for helping us to pull this off on Zoom. But Larry, my eternal thanks to you for rescuing us. I was trying to figure out a way to do this talk. It's really important to us at Carleton that we do this, and we weren't going to do it with COVID, and you rescued us, and it's been phenomenal. You have helped us to redefine conflict reporting. And I'm not sure we'll go back. We'll see what happens next year. So you are brilliant, modest, funny, and I could listen to you for hours. And hundreds of people have tuned in around the world. And you should know, we have been getting inquiries at Carleton this week from African journalists who want to study journalism. And you're just
good. That's when I send you an invoice for all that marketing.
Yeah. So you are an example for journalists around the world. And my only regret is that we couldn't do this in person. So the invitation is open for you to come to Carleton. And there's one last thing I wanted to share with you. We do 2 of these major keynotes in the School of Journalism. They're a big deal. And there's one that we've been doing for 21 years, named for one of our legendary professors, Wolf Kesterton. So the annual Kesterton lecture. It occurs in the spring. And now we do the Storsberg lecture, and it generally occurs in the fall, and it's in its 4th year. Until tonight, over 2 decades, on those previous 24 occasions, those keynotes have never been delivered by a Black man or woman. So I am just so proud of what you have done for us tonight. Your talk, the content, who you are. I'm so proud of that. I am not proud of how long it took us to get here. So thank you, Nahlah and Larry. And finally, just to thank all those who have been watching this on Zoom around the world, across the country. Thank you very much. We will be posting a full recording of this, a transcript and a story and an account later after the fact. And let's do this again next year, hopefully in person. So
thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks everyone very much, and good night.
Good night.